Vladimir Putin has run into a problem that no amount of propaganda, no battlefield spin, and no late-night Kremlin speech can solve. It is not a problem of messaging. It is not even a problem of weapons. It is a problem of numbers. And right now, those numbers are turning against him faster than at any point since the invasion began. In just the first 3 months of 2026, Russia lost 89,000 soldiers. That is not over a year. That is not over a campaign season. That is January, February, and March alone. Roughly 1,000 Russian troops taken out of the fight every single day for 3 straight months. And if that sounds catastrophic, here is the part that should really stop you. That may not even be the worst quarter Russia has had. In other words, the crisis is not peaking, it is deepening. But even that is only the surface of the story. Because the real danger for Putin is not just the body count itself. It is what the body count is doing underneath the surface to Russia's manpower pool, to its economy, to its recruitment system, and to the one political decision Putin has spent years trying to avoid at almost any cost. Once you follow that chain all the way to the end, this stops looking like a bad quarter for the Russian military. It starts looking like the early stage of a war-ending trap. This story has 3 layers. The first is the casualty crisis itself and why the pace of Russian losses is becoming mathematically impossible to ignore. The second is what those losses are buying, or more precisely, what they are failing to buy on the battlefield. And the third is the part that matters most, the point where Russia stops being able to replace the men it is losing, and Putin is forced toward the most politically dangerous option of the entire war. Once you connect all 3, the picture becomes brutally clear. Russia is not just taking horrific losses. It is moving toward a decision that could destabilize the war, the economy, and Putin's own hold on power all at once. Let's start with the numbers themselves, because before we talk about mobilization, recruitment failures, or political panic inside the Kremlin, we need to understand the scale of what Russia is now absorbing on the battlefield. In the first 3 months of 2026 alone, Russia lost 89,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, captured, or otherwise taken out of the fight. That is the headline number, but the real force of it only lands when you break it down. Spread across January, February, and March, it comes out to nearly 30,000 Russian losses per month. Push it further, and you are looking at roughly 1,000 men per day every day for 3 straight months. That alone would be enough to define a military crisis. But the timing makes it worse. January and February are winter months, and winter changes the pace of the war. Ground conditions are harsher. Large-scale maneuvers become harder to sustain. Assault patterns can slow. The killing never stops, but the tempo often shifts. March is different. March is when the battlefield begins to accelerate again. It is when commanders start pushing harder, when offensive pressure rises, and when the expectation inside Russia turns toward spring gains. That matters because it means the 89,000 figure was not built in the most lethal conditions of the year from start to finish. It includes 2 slower months and 1 month that likely surged above the average. And once you see it that way, the number becomes even more dangerous for Moscow. Because this is probably not the ceiling for 2026. It is closer to the floor. If Russia is averaging this level of loss before the full momentum of the spring campaign has fully played out, then the direction is already obvious. The burden is rising, not stabilizing. The war is demanding more men just to preserve pressure, and it is doing so at a pace that becomes harder to politically disguise with every passing week. That is why the headline matters so much. Not because it gives us one more grim statistic to add to the war, but because it tells us something deeper about the structure of the conflict. Russia is no longer suffering losses that can be dismissed as the cost of occasional offensives or isolated failures. It is sustaining attrition at industrial speed. And when a military begins losing people at that tempo, the conversation has to change. The question is no longer whether the losses are severe. The question is what those losses are buying and whether the state imposing them on itself can keep paying the price. But here is where the story turns from catastrophic to almost incomprehensible. Because losses on this scale might still be defensible in military terms if they were buying something decisive. If Russia were burning through men at an extraordinary rate in exchange for a breakthrough that could end the war on its terms, the argument from Moscow would at least have internal logic. Brutal, cynical, and morally bankrupt logic, but logic nonetheless. The real problem for Putin is that the battlefield math is no longer supporting even that case. Russia is losing enormous numbers of troops, and the territorial return on those losses is collapsing. That is the part Putin cannot explain away. Over the course of 2025, Russia lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers while gaining only a relatively small amount of ground. And when analysts compared Russia's territorial gains in the more recent 6-month window to the same period a year earlier, the trend became even worse. The rate of advance was slowing, not accelerating, even as the casualty burden remained catastrophically high. In other words, Russia was paying more and more in blood for less and less land. That is not how a winning offensive behaves. That is how an attritional machine begins to consume itself. Once you put the relationship between casualties and territory into clear terms, the picture becomes devastating. Russia is not simply losing men for every village, tree line, or road junction it takes. It is losing them at a rate that makes the long-term objective look almost absurd. Because this war was never sold to the Russian public as a limited fight for marginal gains, it was framed as a historic mission, a geopolitical correction, something large enough to justify extraordinary sacrifice. But the actual exchange rate on the battlefield tells a different story. The scale of loss is gigantic. The scale of gain is shrinking. And when those two trends move in opposite directions for long enough, they stop describing a strategy. They start describing a trap. That is why this part of the story matters so much. Casualties alone tell you that the war is brutal. Casualties compared to territorial progress tell you whether the brutality is even achieving its stated purpose. Right now, that comparison is becoming harder and harder for Moscow to survive politically, because the closer you look at the numbers, the more they suggest that Russia is not grinding its way toward victory. It is grinding its own manpower into the ground for gains that are becoming strategically smaller, even as the cost keeps rising. And once that reality becomes impossible to ignore, the next question becomes even more dangerous for the Kremlin. If Russia is paying this much for this little, how much longer can it keep replacing the men it is burning through? And that is where the war turns from a battlefield crisis into a manpower crisis, because a military can survive terrible losses for longer than most outsiders expect if it can keep replacing those losses fast enough. That has been one of the defining features of Russia's war effort from the beginning. However brutal the casualty figures became, the Kremlin was still able to push new men into the system, enough to keep assaults going, enough to keep the front from collapsing, enough to preserve the illusion that Russia could absorb almost any level of attrition and keep fighting anyway. That is what makes the current moment so dangerous for Moscow. For the first time in this war, the replacement mechanism itself is starting to look unstable. The real issue is no longer just how many men Russia is losing. It is whether the inflow of new men is still keeping pace with the outflow of casualties. And once that balance starts to tilt the wrong way, the logic of the entire war changes. A military that is losing heavily but replenishing itself can remain violent and dangerous. A military that is losing heavily while failing to replace those losses is moving toward deficit. That word matters, deficit, because once arrivals begin falling below departures for long enough, the damage compounds. Units become thinner. Assault formations become less capable. Commanders are forced to attack with men who are less trained, less prepared, and often less motivated. The front line can still look active. The assaults can still continue. But underneath the surface, the structure starts weakening. The war machine is still moving. Only now it is consuming itself faster than it can rebuild. And that appears to be exactly where Russia is heading. Recruitment targets are already showing signs of strain. The casualty burden is rising. The battlefield is demanding more men just to maintain pressure, while the state is struggling to generate enough new bodies to keep the numbers level. That is the kind of transition that turns a brutal war into a politically dangerous one, because once manpower replacement begins to fail, every casualty figure becomes more consequential than the one before it. Losses are no longer just painful. They become cumulative in a way the system cannot hide forever. That is why this may be the most important turning point in the story so far. Not the fact that Russia is losing thousands of men, horrific as that is, but the possibility that it is now entering a period where it can no longer replace them at the rate this war requires. And once that happens, the Kremlin's problem is no longer just military. It becomes social, economic, and political all at once. The question is no longer how many men Russia can send. It becomes where those men are supposed to come from next. And that is where this Kremlin's problem becomes even harder to contain. Because once a war begins consuming men faster than the state can comfortably replace them, the next line of pressure falls on recruitment. For most of this invasion, Putin avoided the most politically explosive option by leaning on a simpler tool: money. High signing bonuses, regional incentives, contract payments, and the promise of cash far above normal civilian wages allowed the state to keep pulling in volunteers without openly admitting that the war had turned into a national manpower emergency. It was a costly system, but for a time it worked. Now that system is starting to fray. Recruitment targets are becoming harder to meet, not because the Kremlin suddenly stopped wanting more soldiers, but because the economic mechanism it relied on is losing effectiveness. In poorer regions, financial incentives were powerful because the gap between military compensation and civilian opportunity was so large. But that model depends on budgets being able to sustain the offer and on enough men still being willing to accept the risk. The longer the war continues and the more visible the casualty burden becomes, the harder it is to keep using cash as a substitute for legitimacy. That is the real danger for Moscow. A recruitment model built on money can hide a war politically for only so long. It allows the state to present the conflict as something that can be outsourced to willing contractors, to people motivated by income rather than by national emergency. But once the supply of willing bodies begins to tighten, the system starts revealing what it really is: a bridge to coercion. If volunteers are no longer arriving in sufficient numbers, then the state has to either pay dramatically more, which strains already pressured budgets, or begin using indirect pressure to force new people into the pipeline. And that shift is exactly what makes this phase of the war so unstable. Because a recruitment problem is never just a military problem. It spreads. It reaches into local governments, businesses, universities, labor markets, and households. It turns the question of war from something happening somewhere else into something that begins touching daily life inside Russia itself. That is the threshold Putin has spent years trying to avoid. He wanted a war that could keep consuming men without forcing Russian society to fully confront what that consumption meant. But once incentives start weakening, that illusion becomes harder to sustain. And when the state can no longer comfortably buy enough manpower to feed the front, the next stage is almost always darker. The burden starts shifting from persuasion to pressure. The question is no longer whether Russia needs more men. It is how far the system is now prepared to go in order to get them. And that is where the war begins to move into its darkest domestic phase. Because once money stops pulling enough men into the system, the state has only two real options left. It can accept that the war machine is shrinking, or it can start pushing the burden outward into Russian society in ways that are harder to hide and much harder to control. That is what makes the next step so dangerous. The problem is no longer just that Russia needs more soldiers. It is that the state now has to go looking for them in places that expose how badly the volunteer model is breaking down. This is where coercion starts replacing incentive. Not always through one dramatic national announcement and not always through a single visible act of mobilization, but through a series of smaller pressures that reveal the same reality. Local authorities are leaned on. Employers are expected to cooperate. Educational institutions are drawn into the manpower pipeline. The machinery of everyday civilian life begins to absorb the needs of the war. And that is a threshold with enormous political consequences because it pulls the conflict out of abstraction and places it inside offices, factories, campuses, and family decisions. That shift matters because it changes the meaning of recruitment. A volunteer who signs up for money can be framed as making a personal economic choice. A worker nominated through pressure from above or a student pushed towards service through institutional expectation tells a different story. It tells a story of a state running out of easy options. And once that story becomes visible, the war starts looking less like something the Kremlin can manage at a distance, and more like something it is forcing its own society to absorb directly. There is also a deeper danger here for Putin. Coercive recruitment does not just increase political resentment, it distorts the future. When a government begins looking to workplaces and universities as reservoirs of military manpower, it is no longer only pulling fighters from the present. It is draining skills, labor, and human capital from the country's next decade as well. The engineers, technicians, students, and workers who are supposed to sustain the civilian economy become part of the war's attritional machinery instead. That may keep pressure on the front for a little longer, but it does so by weakening the foundations of the state behind it. And that is why this phase of the war is so revealing. It shows that the recruitment crisis is no longer a budgeting problem. It is becoming a regime problem, because once the state starts relying on pressure instead of consent, every new recruit comes with a larger political cost than the one before. The Kremlin may still be able to find more men. The real question is whether it can do so without making the war impossible to quarantine inside Russian society any longer. And that is what brings Putin to the decision he has spent years trying not to make. Because once the volunteer model weakens, once incentives lose power, and once coercion starts spreading through employers, campuses, and local institutions, the next step stops looking like a quiet adjustment. It starts looking like mobilization. Not necessarily in the form of one dramatic declaration at first, but in the form of a widening state claim on Russian society. A claim that says the war can no longer be fed by willing margins alone. It now requires the center. That is the political line Putin has tried to avoid ever since the shock of 2022. The last time the Kremlin moved openly toward wider mobilization, the reaction inside Russia was immediate and deeply revealing. Men of military age fled the country. Border crossings backed up. Families panicked. Protests broke out. The state could still enforce its will, but the moment exposed something Putin had worked very hard to suppress, the war became real in a way propaganda could not soften. It was no longer a distant operation being handled by professionals, contractors, or unnamed patriots somewhere far away. It became personal, direct, and frighteningly close. That is why mobilization matters far beyond the number of uniforms it could generate. It is not just a military decision. It is a political admission. The moment a regime has to pull more openly from the broader population, it is telling the country that the old formula is failing. It is telling the public that voluntary recruitment, regional bonuses, quiet pressure, and managed distance are no longer enough to keep the war going. And for a leader like Putin, who has invested years in presenting control as permanence, that kind of admission is dangerous. It invites fear, resentment, avoidance, and the possibility that parts of society begin reacting not as passive spectators, but as people who now believe they may be next. There is a reason authoritarian systems try to delay this point for as long as possible. Mobilization does not just increase manpower. It redistributes risk. It pushes the war deeper into households, workplaces, and future life plans. It tells millions of people that the conflict is no longer something the state can contain at the edges. It is now asking more directly for their bodies, their labor, and their sons. Even if the Kremlin tries to disguise that process through rolling call-ups, legal adjustments, or selective enforcement, the underlying message is the same. The war is demanding more from Russia because Russia is no longer getting enough from the war. And that is why this may be the most dangerous decision point Putin has faced since the invasion began. Because mobilization could buy him more time militarily while costing him far more politically than he wants to pay. It may be the only lever left that can slow the manpower deficit, but pulling it risks turning a battlefield crisis into an internal crisis of trust, fear, and regime stability. And that is what makes the next layer of this story so brutal for Moscow. Because while Russia is being pushed toward more dangerous forms of recruitment at home, Ukraine is not standing still on the other side of the equation. It is expanding the very tools that make Russia's manpower crisis worse. This is not just a war of attrition anymore. It is becoming a war in which one side is struggling to feed the front, while the other is increasing its ability to kill, disrupt, and exhaust that front faster than before. That shift matters because modern attrition is no longer driven only by artillery barrels and trench assaults. It is increasingly driven by drones, strike coordination, precision targeting, and the ability to widen the kill zone behind the line of contact. Ukraine has been scaling all of those things at once. More drones, better integration, greater reach, more pressure on troop concentrations, logistics nodes, and vulnerable movement corridors. In practical terms, that means Russia is not just losing men in the traditional way. It is losing them inside a battlefield environment that is becoming more hostile, more monitored, and more lethal with time. And that creates the real strategic trap for Putin. Because even if Russia finds more bodies through pressure, coercion, or eventual mobilization, those bodies are being fed into a war that is becoming harder to survive. This is not a static exchange. Ukraine is actively working to raise the monthly cost of Russian offensives by expanding the scale and density of the systems that are already turning assaults into mass casualty events. The more Russia responds to its manpower deficit by sending additional men forward, the more it risks feeding those men into a kill chain that is growing faster than its ability to adapt. There is also an economic dimension to this that makes the situation even more dangerous. Every new soldier Russia tries to recruit or compel into service is being pulled from an economy already strained by labor shortages, uneven industrial capacity, and the war's own financial burden. Every drone Ukraine sends into Russian infrastructure or rear area logistics deepens that strain further. So the crisis is no longer happening on one axis, it is happening on two at the same time. There is degradation at the front and degradation in the rear. There is attrition in manpower and attrition in the economic system required to sustain that manpower. That is why the trajectory matters more than any single monthly figure. If Russia's casualty burden keeps rising while recruitment weakens, while domestic pressure intensifies, and while Ukraine continues scaling the systems that make Russian losses easier to inflict, then the war stops looking like a frozen stalemate with no end in sight. It starts looking like a long compression of the Russian system itself. The only question is whether the breaking point arrives first on the battlefield, in the economy, or inside the political order that is trying to hold both together. So here is the real meaning of the numbers. Russia's losses are no longer just a measure of battlefield brutality. They are becoming a measure of systemic failure. The front is eating men faster than the state can comfortably replace them. The recruitment model that kept the war politically manageable is weakening. The pressure is spreading into workplaces, campuses, and local institutions. Mobilization remains the option Putin fears most, but the alternatives are running out. And on the other side of the line, Ukraine is scaling the very systems that make every Russian attempt to solve this crisis more expensive, more dangerous, and more unsustainable than the last. That is why this war can no longer be understood simply as a contest of territory. It is increasingly a contest of endurance between two systems moving in opposite directions. One is trying to keep feeding a war that is consuming its manpower, its economy, and its political insulation at the same time. The other is trying to make that consumption happen faster than the state can recover from it. And when a war reaches that stage, the question is no longer whether the numbers are bad. The question is what breaks first. Putin still has options, but they are no longer good options. They are choices about where the damage will land on the front in the economy or inside the political system he has spent decades trying to stabilize around himself. That is why the casualty crisis matters so much. Not because it tells us Russia is hurting. It tells us Russia is being pushed toward decisions that could make the hurt impossible to contain. And once that begins, the war stops looking like something Moscow can manage indefinitely. It starts looking like a system running out of ways to hide its own failure.
Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.